Hi AP Econ students, Mr. Muller here, and in today's video we're going to be starting our third unit looking at the theory of the firm, of the business, and how businesses work. In this lesson we're going to be talking about the costs of business and the productions of business, and how those costs and how the revenue that you get from production influences the decisions that companies make. Hope you're excited. I'm excited. Let's get started. So, we got to talk about a bunch of terms and some calculations here to understand how firms make the decisions that they make. First thing we got to talk about is profit, which is total revenue is higher than your total cost. When you take into account all the different costs you have as a business, the rent for your land and the electricity and the insurance and the salaries for all your workers and the costs to get the raw materials to make that good, when the revenue you're making is higher than all those costs, you've made a profit. But when that revenue is lower than your costs, you've made a loss. So you're losing money overall. If we're trying to calculate what total revenue is, it's the amount a firm receives from the sale of goods and services. So how many Big Macs you sold, how many computers you sold, how many cars you sold. And the total cost is the amount the firm spends to produce those goods and services. If I'm running a McDonald's, I got to pay for the land, the insurance, the electricity, the water, my laborers, the supplies. All of that are calculated into my total costs. So the issue with costs is that they're difficult to determine because some costs are very easy to see. Some are called explicit, where it's just easily I can see I'm spending money. So the rent for my McDonald's or the salaries for my employees or advertising on the interweb. I don't even know how people advertise anymore. The equipment to make my Big Macs and my fries and the supplies, the meat, the buns, the fries, those are all explicit costs. But there's also something called implicit costs, which are the costs of the resources that you already have, but there's no necessarily out-of-pocket payment you're making for it. So here's an example. Let's say I'm running a small little business and I'm running a comic book store. And because I want to keep my explicit costs down, I don't have any employees. It's just me running this. Well, some of the opportunity costs that are coming through that are the labor that I'm using. I'm working there all the time. Maybe I don't see my family. Maybe I'm realizing that, hey, I could probably make more money if I invested in something else or change my business around, but I'm not. And the use of personal equipment. Maybe I can't afford new computers, so I just use mine. The issue is that's difficult to calculate. You can't put a number on the extra hours you work or the value of investing in something else or changing your store. But what economists try to do is to calculate what those internal costs could be, and then you add it to your explicit costs to get something called total cost. So total cost is your explicit cost plus your implicit cost. You put them together, that is the total cost for your business. Now, there are different types of profit that you can have because of the idea of total cost. You can have an accounting profit, which is just take your revenue and minus the explicit costs, which you could be up. But then you have something called economic profit, which economists are more interested in. And that's by subtracting the explicit and implicit costs from the revenue that you're getting as a business. And that could be negative. Sure, you could be making an accounting profit, but man, the toll that might be taking on you physically or mentally or emotionally, you may look back and say, even though I'm making money, it's just not worth it. So the question becomes with a firm, how much should we produce? Because we want to make sure that we have an economic, just going to go back to the term, we want to make sure we have an economic profit. So we constantly have to think, if you're running a business, how much am I going to produce? How much am I going to hire someone for? And the product that that firm creates is called an output. How many Big Macs am I going to sell? How many computers? How many cars? How much am I going to create, understanding the external costs and the internal costs to my business? Now, the answer to that is whatever's going to result in the most profit. You do whatever you got to do. Again, marginal thinking is really important in economics. You keep pushing it until you're no longer making that profit. Now, that all goes into play with the factors of production because those are the inputs you use to create those goods and services, the output that you have. And they have to be taken into account, the people you have to hire, the materials you have to buy, the rent that you have to pay on the land that you have. A couple of other important terms here. A production function is the relationship between the inputs the firm uses and the output it creates. So it's the cost between, it's the relationship between all of the things I'm buying, my costs, and how much I'm actually creating from buying all the materials and hiring labor. Now, what we have to think about is marginal product, which is the change in output. So how much more efficiently am I creating Big Macs or cars or computers with one extra input? That could be an extra French fry fryer, or that could be an extra person that's working at my business. How much more output am I getting from doing that? Now, there's a law here, and this is really interesting, called diminishing marginal product. And that occurs that when you put in more inputs, you still may be having an output, but you're not going to have it as efficiently because you only have a fixed amount of some factors of production. You only have a big enough store. You only have a certain amount of materials that you might be able to get. There are some limitations to a firm. And so as you add more of that input, the output, even though it could still be positive, is becoming less and less effective. So the question is, how much should that firm produce? Now, again, one thing with diminishing marginal product, and we just talked about this, I just put the term up here again, is diminishing does not mean negative. When you get to negative, you stop adding that extra input. The common mistake is to stop hiring when you're not being as efficient with your output. But no, that's the mistake. When you run a business, you keep hiring people, you keep putting in those inputs until you're not making a profit. If you're still making some sort of profit, even if it's one JD or $1 or €1, you keep doing it because your goal is to maximize profit in a business. So let's take a look at an example here. Let's think about McDonald's. And here's the number of workers McDonald's can have, the total amount of meals that they can serve. So let's actually, instead of saying McDonald's, because we're looking at meals, let's go with any restaurant chain you can think of, like a Buffalo Wings or any kind of restaurant. So if I have one server, they can put out 5 meals an hour. They can serve, let's say, 5 tables. So my marginal product of labor, how much I'm getting is 5. If I hire 2, they can put out 15. We get maybe more specialized. Maybe one person isn't doing anything. Maybe I'm starting to have one person cook and serve instead of one person doing everything. So my product of labor is 10. If I add in 3, maybe we can get more specialized. I have one person cook, one person serve, one person run the front of the house. My marginal product goes up to 15. If I put it in a 4th, maybe I have someone doing the dishes now. I'm still having more output with my restaurant, but it's not nearly as much. When I had 5 people still putting out output, 6 people still having a positive output, 7 people still having a positive output, 8 people still having a positive output. It's only 2, but I'm still having more output. I'm still making more profit. But notice, when I add a 9th person to my restaurant, I'm actually making less output. Now, why could that be? Because I only have so much of amount of room in my restaurant. Maybe if I hire 9 people, people aren't working as efficiently because people are bumping into each other. There's not enough room. There's not enough space. And people aren't working as efficiently as they could. And that's the law of diminishing marginal product. At some point, you're not going to be as efficient with your output. So what I do when I'm trying to run a business and I'm thinking, how many people do I hire? I hire 8 people. I don't go to that 9th. And this chart just shows you that. Number of workers, the output's going up, and then it's going to start going down. And this shows your marginal product of labor. So, when starting a business, firms always have to think about how much to produce and how to produce it efficiently. You want to have the most profit. Now, there's 2 ways to consider these costs in the short run and the long run. So we're going to talk about the short run first. So not very much time, not years and decades and things like that. In the short run, you have 2 types of costs. You have fixed costs, which are things that you have to pay no matter what. You have your monthly rent, you have your monthly insurance, you have the taxes you have to pay. They don't change week to week or month to month. Then you have your variable costs, which change with how much output you put out. You know, if I'm running a restaurant, the rent I have to pay per month doesn't change regardless of how many meals I serve. Or if I have a car dealership, I still have to pay that rent regardless of how many cars I sell. The variable costs change with output. So if I have to hire more people, if I have to get more raw materials to produce those things, those are variable. They can change week to week and month to month. But the goal is to keep those costs, keep these costs low, because demand's going to alter with time. So let's talk about some important terms and some basic math. So how do we know what the cost of an output is for a business? Now we have two things. We have the average variable cost, which we take all of the wages for your laborers, all the raw materials that you need, all of that stuff, the electricity from being open a little bit longer, and you put that all together, and that's your average variable cost. And your average fixed cost, your insurance, your taxes, your rent, you put that all together, that's your average fixed cost. Now, interestingly, to lower your average fixed cost is to be more efficient with your output, because your fixed costs aren't going to change. So if I'm getting better with my output, if I'm making more profit, then the average fixed cost goes down because I'm selling more of my product, whatever that is, or I'm mowing more lawns, or I'm doing more laundry. Now, the average total cost is you take average variable cost, an average fixed cost, you put it together, and that's your average total cost. Or you can just divide total cost by quantity. There's two ways to do that. So these are some important terms. You may want to watch this again, because we're going to start using them really soon. And take a look at those formulas at the bottom. Okay? So when we are firms are considering costs in the short term, we have to consider marginal costs, which is the increase in cost that occurs from producing one more additional meal or Big Mac or computer or car. And that answers the question, how many of those Big Macs or those cars or the computers or laundry should I do? And when I'm no longer making profits from creating one more of those things, I stop. Now, this is always going to pull your average variable costs and average total costs along as marginal costs are increasing. But as long as your average cost is declining, the firm can lower its cost by increasing its output. So, marginal cost is the change in total variable cost divided by the change in quantity, or it's the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. That's how we can figure out the marginal cost. Again, you may need to rewatch that again. Now we're going to start using these numbers here. So let's take a look at if I'm working at a McDonald's. So I have the amount of Big Macs I can produce per hour, the total variable cost for the wages for my employees, for the equipment, for the food, the raw food I need to bring in. We have the fixed costs, which are 100 JD or 100 euros or $100 a month. That's my rent, that's my insurance, that's my taxes. It doesn't change. So if I add these two up, here's my total costs. Take a look here. Now, if we're looking at the average variable cost, which is average total variable cost here, divided by quantity, so we divide 30 by 10, we get 3 JD or $3 or 3 euros. So that's how we determine average variable cost. Our average fixed cost is total fixed cost divided by quantity. And notice it's going down because, again, fixed costs are the same regardless of your output. And so if your output increases, the average fixed costs go down, which is why that's a good thing. Now, to get your average total costs, you can divide your total cost by the quantity, or you can just add average variable cost or average fixed cost. So if we're just adding these two, 3 plus 10 is 13, 2.5 plus 5 is 7.5. That's how we get our average total costs. And here are our marginal costs, which is the change, that's what the triangle means, the change in total variable cost divided by the change in quantity, or the change in total costs divided by the change in quantity. So we're going to go with change of total variable cost because that's what we're given. Let's go by division of change of total cost divided by the change of quantity. And that's how we can figure this out. So we've got 30, because the change here is 30, by the change, which is 10, and that's 3. Now, as a business, you're trying to think, how much do I want to produce? And the goal is you do it until your costs go up. So if you notice, costs are going down. My average total cost is going down as I make 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. And then if I make 80 Big Macs, I'm actually My average total costs are going up. Okay, now I need to stop. So if you're looking for how many Big Macs you produce 70. Your average total cost is down. Again, your marginal cost can go down and then go up. Again, you're getting diminishing marginal production here, but the goal of the business is how much do I produce? You stop when your average total cost goes up. So that's all small scale, short run. If we're looking at what costs do firms consider in the long run, those things change. Because in the long run, all costs are variable. You can negotiate your rent. You can move. You can use loopholes to fix your taxes. You can change the insurance plan you have. So in the long run, nothing is fixed. Everything is variable. And firms have more control. Now, what you have to consider then is the size of the production process. Over 10 years, what is the scale of your business? Now, it can grow or it can diminish based on what you think is going to happen in those 10 years. And you do this to avoid negative marginal product. You want the marginal product to keep going down. When it goes up, you stop. Now, in an efficient scale, your output level is minimizing average total costs, which in the long run, all costs are variable, right? So it's minimizing average total cost in the long run. But you can have different types of economies. You can have with scale. You can have an economy of scale, which is when your average total costs decline as your output continues to expand. So if you are a construction company that's building houses, the bigger contract you can get to build more and more houses in one contract, your costs go down because you could buy in bulk. You can buy more wood. You can buy more equipment. You can get better deals. That's how firms like Costco work, if you've ever heard of that store. They buy in bulk, so you can't buy one roll of toilet paper. You have to buy like 50. And the reason that works is they buy in bulk. Things are cheaper because you're buying more of that product. You also have something called a diseconomy of scale, when in the long run, your average total costs rise as your output expands. So even though you're outputting more, your total costs are rising. That's when you stop, because bigger doesn't always mean better. And a great example is an expanding bureaucracy. When a hospital or a business, or a lot of cases public government jobs, as you start adding more and more jobs, your total costs rise because you're hiring more people, but your output is getting less efficient. That's when you stop. What you can also have is a constant return to scale, when your total costs are constant as your output expands. Those are things like restaurant chains, if you're buying a franchise, because they've done, if you're buying a McDonald's, if you're going to open up a McDonald's and become part of that franchise, there's been so much math on the total costs that they're staying variable. So that's an example of a constant return to scale. So here's what that looks like. So if you're starting off in a business, your average total cost should be going down as you're expanding because it's getting cheaper to buy those things and producing more, as we looked at with that example of McDonald's previously. But you can have an economy of scale. At some point, you can either keep producing things and things continue to get cheaper, things can become more expensive, bureaucracies, or things can become constant because you figured out what the math is for everything and you just can't get it any lower. So that completes our lesson today. Hope you learned something you didn't know before. And in class, we're going to be going through scenarios for you to be able to calculate these things and become more used to these terms. Average total cost, average variable cost, fixed costs. It's a lot of new language to pick up. So we're going to become more comfortable with it in class. Hope you learned something you didn't know before. Thanks for watching.